This is LSAT Prep Test 136, Section 1, Passage 3. This is about Toni Morrison's novel Jazz and how its narrative structure mirrors the way jazz music actually works. It's a medium difficulty passage, and the passage reads kind of smoothly, but the problem is students walk away thinking they understood it when they only got half of it. Now, of course, this is a humanities passage. The author is arguing one specific thing, that Morrison used jazz as a blueprint for how the novel is constructed, theme versus structure. And that distinction runs through the whole passage. Now, paragraph 1 starts off with a wide view on purpose. Music and literature have always overlapped. African American writers, especially, have drawn on music as theme and metaphor. You can move through that stuff quickly, it's just background. But you want to watch out for what happens at the end of the paragraph. The author says nobody before Morrison used a musical genre as the structuring principle for an entire novel. That is the turning point. Everything before that is here's what other people did. Everything after it is here's what Morrison did differently. And if you miss that twist, you're going to read the rest of the passage as general praise instead of a specific argument. Now, paragraph 2 is the core of the passage. You want to slow way down here. This is where the author shows you what structuring principle actually means. It's about narration, not the plot being set in the Harlem jazz scene. Now, the narrator has this disembodied voice that slides between omniscience and the character's own perspectives. The characters get sections set off by quotation marks like they're stepping up to take a solo. And the author makes that comparison explicit. The narrative is analogous to the playing of a jazz band. Ensemble sound, then individual performances woven through it. And that analogy is the backbone of the entire passage. Every question about structure or main point is tracing back to this paragraph. Now, paragraph 3 brings in Duke Ellington. Now, this is not a random aside. The author is using Ellington to make the Morrison argument stronger. Ellington composed around his musicians' individual voices. No matter how wild a solo got, it stayed inside the composer's framework, and that is exactly what Morrison does. Her characters speak in their own voices, but they never escape the narrator's control. The Ellington paragraph exists to give you a concrete model for understanding how jazz works. Think of it as an analogy within an analogy. If a question asks you why paragraph 3 is there, the answer is about supporting the claim in paragraph 2. It's not about Ellington for Ellington's sake. Now, paragraph 4 is where the argument lands. Morrison creates something that feels improvised, but is actually carefully built. The word paradoxically, right near the top of the paragraph, is doing serious work here. She is simulating spontaneity inside a fixed structure. That is the entire achievement the author is celebrating. And notice the very end. They say jazz redefines possibilities of the narrative point of view. That is a big claim. The author isn't saying Morrison did something nice. The author is saying she changed what novels can do. Now, the key move here is the gap between music as content and music as form. Other writers put music in their books. Morrison built her book out of music. And that one distinction drives every important question on this passage. Now, the author's stance here is strongly positive, but it's not vague admiration, it's more targeted. The author admires a specific technical innovation, narrative structure modeled on jazz performance. The trap here is picking answers that sound enthusiastic, but stay too general. If we were to ask, does Morrison masterfully use jazz themes? That's wrong. It's that Morrison's narrative structure mirrors jazz composition. It's all about precision here. Now, one more thing you want to watch for. The passage talks about what many African American writers have done. Then it talks about what Morrison did, and students mix those up. When a question asks about Morrison's specific achievement, you don't want to pick an answer that describes the tradition she came out of. She's being set apart from that tradition, not lumped into it. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to make sure you're clear on these 3 things. First, what is the difference between using music as a metaphor and using it as a structuring principle? Second, what exactly does the Ellington comparison illustrate about Morrison's technique? And third, what 2 things does the word paradoxically hold together in that last paragraph? So that was passage number 3. We're going to move on now to passage number 4. just getting set up for that one. And by the way, folks, if you're looking for support, I'm offering free LSAT tutoring for everybody watching this now and later. The link to book that free tutoring lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. Now, this is LSAT Prep Test 136, Section 1, Passage 4. This is a science passage about the discovery of nuclear fission, medium difficulty passage. The content's pretty straightforward here, but the author has a specific argument buried inside what looks like a history lesson, and if you miss the argument, you're going to answer questions about the story rather than the point. Now, the passage is doing something sneaky here. It looks like it's telling you how nuclear fission was discovered, but it's arguing instead that scientific breakthroughs get delayed because researchers can't see past their own assumptions. The fission story is just the proof for that claim. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 3. That's where I'll spend the most time, but we'll build up to it. Now, paragraph 1 is the setup, and it's doing two jobs at once. The first few sentences give you the author's thesis directly. Scientific understanding does not build smoothly on data. Evidence gets ignored. Breakthroughs get overlooked. Then the author pivots into the specific case, splitting the atom 1934 to 1939. You get the key names, Fermi, Meitner, and the fact that Meitner made the crucial theoretical connection. But notice what the author slips in at the end. Scientists compiled evidence that fission had been achieved without recognizing what they were witnessing. So that phrase there is the whole passage in miniature. This tells you exactly what the author cares about. Then paragraph 2 gives you the reason everybody was blind. You want to read this at a moderate speed. The point here is that theoretical physicists had already shown splitting atoms should be possible in principle. But the experimenters weren't trying to do it, and they weren't open to the possibility it could happen by accident. Then you get the common view that breaking a uranium nucleus would be like throwing a pebble through a window to collapse a house. In other words, it's ridiculous, it's impossible. And this paragraph exists to explain why smart people looked at the right data and saw the wrong thing. This is building the case that assumptions were the real obstacle. Now, paragraph 3, you want to slow way down here. This is long and every part of it matters. Meitner picks up the Italian research. Fermi and others find strange radioactive substances from bombarding uranium, and nobody can identify them. The author gives you two reasons why they stayed unidentified. The first is practical. They were tiny quantities, dangerous materials, hard to analyze. But then the author says more significantly and gives you the real reason. Everyone expected the products to be elements close to uranium on the periodic table, and that expectation made them blind to what was actually happening. Don't skim past the phrase more significantly because the author is ranking the causes for you. The practical problems matter less than the wrong assumption. And then the story accelerates. Meitner flees Nazi Germany. Hahn keeps experimenting. And Hahn writes to Meitner with a shock. One of the substances is barium. And barium has no business being there if the old model is right. Its atomic structure would make it impossible to produce through any known mechanism. And here's where it gets specific. Hahn noticed that the chemical evidence went against all previous experience of nuclear physics. But he also noticed something that should have been a dead giveaway. The protons in the barium and technetium added up to the number in a uranium nucleus. And the math was staring everybody in the face, it turned out. The atom had been split, and nobody had said it yet. Paragraph 4 is short and wraps up the story. Meitner connects the experimental data to theory. She coins the term nuclear fission. She publishes fast. Other scientists confirm it. And then, and this is the author driving the thesis home, it became clear the relevant evidence had been there for some time. Everybody just lacked the right conceptual link. So that tells us it was the thinking that was the problem, not the evidence. Now, the key move here is the gap between having evidence and understanding what it means. And the hardest questions will test whether you see that distinction. Fission wasn't discovered late because the experiments failed. It was discovered late because nobody had the right way to interpret experiments that had already succeeded. Now, the author thinks assumptions actively blocked progress. Not slowed it down, but blocked it entirely. The main trap here is treating this as a neutral timeline of events. Students who read it that way will grab answers that describe what happened instead of why it took so long. And that's how you're going to get main point and author's attitude questions wrong. Now, you want to know that Meitner is not just another character in the story. She's the person who broke through the barrier of assumptions. So the passage treats her contribution as different in kind from everybody else's. Hahn found the surprising data. Meitner understood what it meant. And so if a question asks you to distinguish their roles, that's the difference. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to make sure you're clear on these three things. First, why does the author rank the causes of the failed identification in paragraph 3? Second, what exactly did Meitner contribute that Hahn didn't? And third, what does the author mean by the right conceptual link at the very end? So that was passage number 4. We're going to go on now to LSAT Prep Test 135. Just pulling it up here. This is LSAT Prep Test 135, Section 3, Passage 1. It's about Latina autobiographers in the 1980s who broke the traditional rules of autobiography. It's a low difficulty passage. The passage is friendly, pretty straightforward, but it's got one trap that catches a lot of students, and we're going to get to that. Now, this is a humanities passage. It's an appreciation piece. The author thinks these writers did something genuinely new with autobiography, and the whole passage is building that case. The main point is that these Latina writers reshaped the genre of autobiography by using mixed forms and nonlinear structures to express identities that a standard autobiography couldn't capture. Now, the most important paragraph here is paragraph 4. That's where the passage connects form to meaning. Everything before it is showing you what these writers did. Paragraph 4 tells you why it matters. Now, paragraph 1 is a timeline. The 1980s brought a wave of Latina writing in poetry, fiction, and short stories. Then by the end of the decade, autobiography showed up too. You get 3 book titles and 3 author names. Do not memorize any of them. The passage treats these books as a group, not as individuals. Your only job here is to register that these are autobiographies by Latina writers and that the passage considers them notable. You want to skim through this part. Then paragraph 2 tells you what makes these books unusual. 2 things. First, they cross linguistic boundaries, English and Spanish mixed together. Second, they cross genre boundaries, essays, sketches, poems, stories, journal entries, all in one book. And the passage makes a small but important point at the end. None of these forms gets priority over the others. And that detail matters later. It tells you that mixing is the whole strategy. You want to read this at a pretty normal speed, because you'll need the facts about these in a minute. Now, paragraph 3 gives you the examples. Anzaldúa blends personal history with community. Anzaldúa blends personal history with community history. Moraga organizes her book around political development instead of time. And here's where you've got to be careful. A literary critic shows up and says this departure from chronological order marks a difference between women's autobiographies and men's. That is an outside voice. The author is borrowing that critic's authority, but the critic's claim is narrower than the passage's main argument. The passage is about more than just chronology. It's about every structural choice these writers made. And so if a question asks you about the function of that critic's opinion, it is supporting evidence, not the main point. And then paragraph 4 is where you slow way down. Starts with the 3rd book, the one that weaves together a mother's and daughter's voices. Their pieces are not separated, they're commenting on each other. And then the passage does something really deliberate. It admits this structure looks fragmentary and confusing. It puts that right on the table. But then it immediately tells you this is intentional. So this is a carefully designed experiment. And that pivot is the heart of the passage, because the very next sentence gives you the payoff. The mixing of structures mirrors the complexity of these writers' identities. Form reflects content. Multi-genre structure reflects multifaceted identity. That is the argument. Everything else in this passage either leads to this sentence or extends it. And then paragraph 5 is a short closing. These writers didn't force their lives into existing autobiography templates, they changed the template. And the very last lines add an emotional layer. These writers want to speak for themselves after being silent for too long. That's real, but don't let it pull your focus. The passage is not primarily about oppression or silence, it's about literary innovation. The silence line explains the urgency behind the innovation. It is motivation, not the main point. Now, the key move here is that connection between identity and form at the end of paragraph 4. Every structural feature the passage describes, mixed genres, mixed languages, non-chronological order, multiple voices, all of that feeds into one claim. These writers' identities were too complex for a standard autobiography, so they built new structures to match. That is what the hardest questions are going to test. And the author admires these writers with no reservations. You're going to see words like innovative and revolutionized. There is no pushback anywhere in the passage. There's no however, no critics object. It is a straight positive take. The main trap here is picking an answer that is too narrow. The passage describes at least 4 different structural innovations. Students will latch onto one, usually chronology, because the literary critic makes a big deal of it, and they're going to pick an answer that treats it as being the whole story. But chronology is just one example inside a bigger argument about form reflecting identity. Any answer that reduces the passage to a single technique is probably wrong. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, what is the difference between what the literary critic says and what the author's overall argument is? Second, why does the passage admit the structure looks confusing before calling it intentional? And third, can you state the connection between these writers' identities and their structural choices in one sentence? If you can do that, you're going to be ready. So that was passage 1. We're going to go on to passage 2 now. This is LSAT PrepTest 135, Section 3, Passage 2. It's about archivists trying to preserve records while modern storage media keeps dying faster than old media ever did. It's a low difficulty passage, pretty clean structure. But the passage does set a trap by spending most of its time on one problem and then pivoting to a different, bigger problem at the end. Now, this is a policy-style passage. The author is building an argument that the real crisis isn't fragile media, it's the combination of fragile media and massive volume, making it impossible for archivists to sort what matters from what doesn't before it's too late. Now, the most important paragraph here is the last one. That's where the author finally tells you what they actually think. Everything before it is just getting you there. Now, paragraph 1 sets up the problem with a simple trick. It walks you backward through time. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia, they're still around. Parchment manuscripts, still fine. But books from the 1980s on acidic paper, those are already unreadable. Color photographs, you've got maybe 40 years. Videotapes, 20 years. Every example is shorter than the last. And that is the author building a pattern. The newer the medium, the faster it dies. You don't need to memorize these details, just see the pattern. It is a countdown. Once you catch it, you can move fast. Every example is doing the same job. Now, paragraph 2 is the fake solution. Computer technology looks like the answer. You can transfer everything to disks or tape, and it barely takes up space. Sounds great. But then you want to watch what happens next. The author spends the rest of the paragraph tearing it apart. Each new generation of technology makes the last one useless. Optical discs from the 1990s are already unreadable. Digital storage tape is safe for maybe 10 years. So the fix has the same disease as the problem. And then right near the end, it's my dog walking around back there. I'm going to redo that part for posterity. Each new generation of technology makes the last one useless. Optical discs from the 1990s, already unreadable. Digital storage tape, safe for maybe 10 years. So the fix has the same disease as the problem. And then right near the end, you get this moment where even the archivists who see the issue are running out of time. That is the author tightening the screws. So this paragraph should change your read of the whole passage. It's not heading toward a solution, it is closing the exits. Now, paragraph 3 is where the author stops describing the problem and starts telling you what it actually means. New storage technologies might show up fine, but that just hands archivists a new burden. They've got to choose what to save and what to let go. And they've got to do it fast because conventional media is already crumbling. Now the author drops in Homer, Virgil, and Plato. Homer and Virgil survived because people kept making copies on purpose. Plato's works were lost for centuries and only showed up by accident in monasteries. And that contrast is doing real structural work. It's showing you that preservation has always been a mix of luck and deliberate effort. And then the author delivers the actual point in the final two sentences. You want to slow way down here. The danger isn't that some masterpiece disappears. It's that the sheer volume of records on bad media will make it virtually impossible to sort the essential from the disposable in time. And that word virtually matters. The author isn't saying it's hopeless, they're saying the scale of the problem is what makes it different from anything before. Now, the key move here is the pivot from durability to decision-making. And the whole passage looks like it's about fragile media, and it is for 2 paragraphs. But the author's actual concern shows up late. It's about what happens when you combine fragile media with an overwhelming amount of information. The problem stops being physical and becomes logistical. Now, the author's tone is worried but measured. They're not panicking here. They're laying out a structural problem and saying it's getting worse. The main trap here is any answer that stops at durability. If a main point answer says modern media is less durable than older media, that's true, but also incomplete. The passage builds past that. The right answer will connect fragility to volume and land on the sorting problem. You want to watch out for wrong answers that sound right because they cover paragraph 1 really well, but ignore paragraph 3. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to make sure you're clear on these 3 things. First, why does the author list so many types of media in paragraph 1? It's not to teach you history, it's to show a trend. Second, what job do Homer and Plato do in paragraph 3? They show that preservation has always required active choices. And third, what exactly is the danger in that final sentence? It's being buried under too much stuff to save the right things in time. So that was passage 2. We're going to cover passage 3 now. This is LSAT PrepTest 135, section 3, passage 3. It is a comparative or dual passage set about why blackmail is illegal. Medium difficulty passage. The passages are not hard to read individually. The danger is in blending them together in your head because they both talk about blackmail, but they're built on completely different logic. Now, passage A frames blackmail as a paradox. Passage B treats it as being no big deal. That gap is the whole game here. Now, passage A, paragraph 1, you want to slow way down here. The author is doing something specific. They're making you feel stuck. You've got 2 perfectly legal acts: revealing embarrassing information and asking someone for money, but they become a crime when you combine them. And so the author is listing out the legal rights on purpose. Free speech, the right to seek money. They want you nodding along thinking, yeah, those are legal. So the paradox hits even harder. This paragraph is set up, but it's load-bearing. If you skim it, you're not going to feel the weight of the problem, and the solution in paragraph 2 is not going to click. Now, paragraph 2 is the most important paragraph in either passage where you slow way down. The author offers a real answer to the paradox. Blackmail is criminal because of its triangular structure. It's got 3 parties, not 2. The blackmailer threatens the victim, but the leverage comes from harm that third parties would cause. The victim isn't paying to stop the blackmailer from doing something. The victim is paying to stop other people from reacting. And that distinction matters enormously. The author calls this the state's chip, meaning the blackmailer is grabbing enforcement power that belongs to the government and using it for personal gain. If you flatten this into a simple person A threatens person B story, you're going to pick wrong answers. Now, passage B, you want to pick up the pace. The passage here is more descriptive and less tricky. Roman law didn't have a separate blackmail category at all. Roman jurists just looked at any action and asked 2 things. First, did it cause harm? Second, was the action itself legal or illegal? That was the whole analysis. Now, paragraph 1 of passage B gives you that system in a few sentences. Don't overthink it. The key point is what's missing. There is no paradox. Rome never combined 2 legal acts and asked why the combination was illegal. They just didn't think that way. Now, paragraph 2 of passage B is where students tend to get tripped up. The Roman assumption was that revealing someone's shameful information caused real harm, so the burden of proof shifted. The person holding the information had to prove they had a good reason to reveal it. And here is the part most people read too fast. The truth was not enough. Even if the information was true, it was only protected if it served a legitimate purpose and involved something the public had a real interest in. So that word only is doing a lot of work in the Roman framework. You don't want to blow past it. Now, the key move here, these passages are not offering competing answers to the same question. They're asking completely different questions. Passage A asks, how can combining two things that are legal create a crime? Passage B asks, does this action cause harm? And is there a justification for it? Rome never faced the paradox because Roman law was not built on individual rights that needed to be reconciled. It was built on harm. Different starting point, different system, no contradiction to resolve. Now, the biggest trap in this passage set is treating passage B as if it solves passage A's problem, but it doesn't. It avoids it. Any answer choice that says Roman law resolved the blackmail paradox or answered the question passage A raises is wrong. Rome didn't answer the question. Rome never even asked it. Now, the author of passage A is analytical. They're genuinely wrestling with a legal puzzle and offering the triangular structure as a real explanation. The author of passage B is more neutral. They're describing how a different legal system worked without saying it's better or worse. You want to watch out here for attitude questions that try to make passage B's author sound more opinionated than they are. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, can you explain the triangular structure without looking back at the passage? Remember, it's three parties here, not two. Second, why didn't Roman law produce a blackmail paradox? It's because it's a different system with different starting points, different assumptions. And third, in the Roman framework, what had to be true for revealing shameful information to be legal? The truth alone wasn't enough. You had to have legitimate purpose and public interest. If you're solid on those three questions, you're going to be ready. So that was passage 3. We're going to cover passage 4 now. This is LSAT PrepTest 135, section 3, passage 4. This is a science passage about restoring plant diversity on overfarmed European land. It's a low difficulty passage, but there's one spot where students tend to get lazy and that costs points. This is a problem, then experiment passage. Here's the problem, here's what we tried, here's what we found. The structure is clean. Your job is to keep those distinctions separate. The most important paragraph is paragraph 4. That is where the findings land and where the author tips their hand about what the real solution is. Everything before it is just building toward that moment. Now, paragraph 1 is the problem setup. Europe overproduced crops for years. Now they're pulling hundreds of thousands of acres out of production. But you can't just stop farming and expect nature to bounce back because the soil's trashed. The nutrients are gone. It's been loaded up with fertilizer. And when you leave it alone, thistles and weeds move in first and choke out everything else. So doing nothing doesn't work. The fastest fix, which is stripping the topsoil, is way too expensive at this scale. Nature will heal itself gradually, but that's going to take a while, of course. That is the gap the whole study is trying to close. How do you speed up what nature does slowly? You want to read paragraph 1 carefully. It's background, but every detail sets up why the experiment matters. Now, paragraph 2 is pure method. A former cornfield in the Netherlands, cleared, divided into 20 plots. Some replanted with corn or left bare as controls. The rest split into 2 groups. One got a mix of native grasses and herbs. The other got the same mix, plus clover and toadflax. The plant names don't matter, of course. What matters is they tested different seed mixtures against each other and against doing nothing. You want to move through this quickly. It's set up for the results. Paragraph 3 is where the results start, and it does 2 different things. And you've got to catch the split here. The first half reports what happened with the seeds. After 3 years, the seeded plots pushed out the thistles. Even the plots with fewer seed varieties lost their thistles. But the control plots, thistles everywhere. So the seeds clearly worked. That is the first finding. Then the paragraph pivots. Right around on some of the plots, the study introduces a completely different variable. They took soil from nearby land that had been out of production for 20 years and scattered it on some plots. to introduce nematodes, fungi, and microorganisms that healthy soil has and farmed soil does not have. That is the second arm of the experiment. If you skim past it, you're going to miss what the passage is actually about. Now, paragraph 4 is the payoff. The enriched plots, the ones that got the old soil, did better than the unenriched ones. But here is the catch. They still didn't do as well as plants growing naturally on that nearby land. And so the soil transfer helped, but it wasn't enough to fully close the gap. Because farmed soil isn't just missing good organisms, it's overrun with bad ones, like aggressive disease organisms that crowd out the helpful stuff. The author specifically mentions mycorrhiza here. I'm not sure how to say that word. Let me see if I could rephrase that. The author specifically mentions fungi that attach to plant roots and protect them from disease. Farmed land has been stripped of them. So the preliminary conclusion is that you can't just fix what's above the ground. You've got to fix what's below it. Underground diversity drives above ground diversity. And the proposed next step is to systematically sow beneficial microorganisms into the soil alongside the seed. That two-part approach, seeds plus soil biology, is the whole point of the passage. Now, the key move is the shift from planting to soil. The passage opens like it's about which seeds to use. By the end, it's about what's living in the dirt. So if you walk away thinking this was just about seed mixtures beating thistles, you've got half the passage. The second half is where the hardest questions are going to come from. Now, in terms of tone, the author is cautiously optimistic. They say preliminary results and now believe in the last paragraph, and those are doing real work. We're telling us the researchers think this combined approach can work, but they have not yet proven it. The trap is picking answers that overstate the conclusion. Nothing in this passage says the problem is solved. It says they found a promising direction. If a choice treats these early findings as an established fact, that's going to be wrong. Now, one more thing you want to watch for. The passage describes two findings that look like they could be competing but actually build on each other. Seeds alone beat doing nothing. Seeds plus soil biology beat seeds alone. Some questions are going to try to get you to treat these as separate strategies, but they're not. They are the layers, and the author wants both. Now, before you go on to the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, why didn't the Before you go to the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, why didn't the enriched plots match the naturally restored land? Second, what specific role do fungi play, and why does their absence matter? And third, what is the difference between the control plots and the unenriched seed plots, and why does the passage need both? So that's passage 4. If you're looking for more support, I'm offering free LSAT tutoring for everybody watching this now and later. The link to book that free tutoring lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. I'll be back tomorrow for the daily live Q&A at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, IG, wherever you're watching this. I'll see you all then.